A man crouches beside a charcoal fire in a courtyard that is not his, holding cold hands out toward the coals, and every face around that fire belongs to the enemy. He is not there by accident. He is not a bystander who wandered in. He is not, whatever you have been told, a coward hiding at a safe distance from trouble. He is the one man who followed. The others are gone, scattered into the dark orchards outside the city. And he is here, inside the walls, close enough to feel the heat of the fire and the heat of the danger at the same time. Look at the scene. The coals, the huddle of guards and servants, the gate behind him with a girl still standing at it. A cold spring night in the hills of Jerusalem, under a moon nearly full, because it is Passover. It is an ordinary picture. A group of tired people warming themselves in the small hours before dawn. And this ordinary huddle around a fire is about to become the most famous failure recorded anywhere in the New Testament. 3. 3 times he will say he does not know a man he has loved for 3 years. 3 denials before a single rooster finishes crowing inside the space of a few short hours. And here's the thing, almost everyone gets wrong about that night. You have probably been taught that Peter denied Jesus because he was weak, because he cracked under pressure, because in the end, he was a coward. But watch what actually happens, step by step, and you find something stranger and far more human. Peter did not fail because he ran away. 10 other men did exactly that, and Scripture barely mentions them again. Peter failed because he got closer than anyone else dared to go. His failure is the failure of the only man brave enough to be there to fail. That is a completely different story than the one most of us were handed. And it is the story we are going to walk through tonight, in the exact order it happened. The boast, the arrest, the fire, the questions, the look, and the sound that broke him. Let us start at the beginning. To understand the fire, you have to back up a few hours, to a room and a table. It is Passover night. Jesus and his closest friends are gathered in a borrowed upper room, the bread broken, the cups poured, the city outside quiet and full of pilgrims. And somewhere in that long, heavy evening, Jesus says something that lands like a stone. He tells them that this very night, every one of them is going to fall away. All of them. Before morning. Peter cannot let that stand. He is the one who speaks first, the one who always speaks first. And what he says is this: even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Hear the shape of it. Everyone else might crumble, but not me. I am the exception. I am the reliable one. Jesus answers him quietly, and the answer is a prediction so specific it is almost cruel in its precision. Before the rooster crows, Peter will disown him 3 times. Not once in a moment of panic. 3 times. Count it out. And Peter doubles down. This is the part we tend to skip past. He does not just object, he raises the stakes. I will lay down my life for you, he says. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. He means every word. That is the man we are dealing with at the start of this night. Not a doubter, not a quiet skeptic in the back. The loudest, surest, most devoted voice in the room, promising death before betrayal. Slow down on that promise, because it is easy to say and hard to mean. To lay down your life for someone is not a phrase you throw across a dinner table. Peter was not being poetic. He had watched this teacher walk into hostile towns, corner the powerful, and refuse to back down. He knew, in some real way, that following Jesus might cost him everything. And he looked at that cost and said, out loud, in front of everyone, I will pay it. That is not the language of a man half in. That is a man all in, staking his whole self on a loyalty he was sure would hold. Which is exactly why the collapse hurts so much. You do not weep bitterly over a promise you never meant. You weep like that only when you meant it with everything you had. Now, it is easy to hear that boast and roll our eyes. Arrogant Peter, we think. Overconfident, mouth running ahead of his faith. But look closer at the table, because there is something we miss. When Jesus said all of them would fall, all of them protested. Matthew tells us the others said the same thing. Every man there believed he would stay. Peter was not more arrogant than the rest. He was just louder. He said out loud what every heart in that room was quietly certain of, that when the moment came, they would be brave. The tragedy of Peter is not that he was worse than the others. It is that he was the only one honest enough and bold enough to put his certainty on record before it was tested. And within a few hours, it would be tested, because outside, in the dark, the moment was already coming for him. Then the torches came through the trees. Then the torches came through the trees. Jesus had led his friends out of the city, across the Kidron Valley, to a garden of olive trees called Gethsemane. And into that quiet grove came a mob: soldiers, officers of the priests, servants carrying lanterns and clubs, the light of their torches swinging between the trunks. Judas was with them. And in the confusion of that arrest, one man drew a sword. It was Peter. Of course it was Peter. He swung at the head of the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus, and took off his ear. Remember that name. Remember that ear. It comes back before the night is over. Jesus told Peter to put the sword away, healed the man, and let himself be taken. And in that moment, something breaks in the group of disciples. All of them run. Everyone. They vanish into the dark orchards and the sleeping city, and the Gospels simply lose sight of them, except two. John tells us that Peter followed. He followed at a distance, yes, but he followed. He trailed the arrest party back across the valley, up toward the walls, all the way to the house of the high priest himself. And you need to understand whose house that was. The high priest was Caiaphas. The historian Josephus, writing later in the 1st century, tells us Caiaphas held the highest religious office in the nation, appointed and backed by Rome, one of the most politically powerful men in Jerusalem. This was not a modest home. This was a fortified compound with a gated courtyard and armed servants, the private residence of the man leading the push to have Jesus killed. Walking toward that gate was like walking into the headquarters of the people who wanted your teacher dead and asking to be let in. There is more. The later rabbinic writings, the Mishnah, record that trials involving a man's life were supposed to be held in daylight, never at night, and never on the eve of a festival. Yet here is a gathering assembling in the small hours of Passover to condemn a man before sunrise. Everything about that night was irregular, rushed, and dangerous. The rules were being bent, and everyone inside those walls knew it. That is the room Peter was trying to get near, and here's the danger he was walking into with his eyes open. Inside those walls, a man was being tried for his life in the middle of the night by people who had already decided to kill him. If they would bend every rule to destroy the teacher, what would they do with a follower caught in their own courtyard, a follower who had drawn a sword just hours before? Peter was not safe there for a single second. Every minute he stayed was a minute he was gambling his life. It would be like a man whose friend has just been dragged into a hostile police station in the dead of night, and instead of running, he walks up the steps, talks his way past the front desk, and sits down in the waiting room to be near him. That is not the behavior of a coward. That is love overriding good sense. Think about what that takes. 10 of his closest friends had already chosen the dark. They chose safety, distance, the road out of town. No one would have blamed Peter for going with them. In fact, running was the reasonable thing to do. But he didn't. He walked toward the one place in the city most likely to get him arrested, or worse, because he could not make himself leave. Whatever else you say about what happens next, start here. Of all the men who loved Jesus, Peter is the only one who followed him through that gate. He couldn't get in on his own. John tells us another disciple, one known to the high priest's household, spoke to the girl keeping the door, and she let Peter through. And the moment he crossed that threshold, the trap was already set. Because inside that courtyard there was a fire, and then he stepped toward the light of the fire. John, who was there, gives us a detail the other Gospels leave out, and it matters more than it looks. He tells us it was a charcoal fire. In the original language, he uses a very specific word for it, a word that appears only twice in the entire New Testament. Hold on to that. Twice. Right now, it is just a cold man moving toward warmth. The servants and officers had made a fire of coals in the middle of the courtyard because the night was cold, and they were standing around it warming themselves. And Peter stood there with them and warmed his hands. Picture how exposed that is. He has followed his arrested friend into the enemy's compound, and now he is standing in a circle of firelight, his face lit up, surrounded by the very people who work for the man trying to kill Jesus. He is close enough to hear the trial, and he is lit up like an actor on a stage. The first blow comes from the smallest person there, not a soldier, not an officer, the servant girl who had opened the gate for him. She looks at him in the firelight, and something clicks. She says he was with Jesus of Nazareth, and Peter, who hours ago swore he would die first, says 4 words. "Woman, I do not know him." That is it. The great promise, the drawn sword, the man who followed through the gate, undone by a teenage doorkeeper's glance. He doesn't storm out. He doesn't run. He just says the words, and he stays by the fire. Now here is where the Gospels do something honest that I want to point out, because it tells us they are not smoothing the story into a neat lesson. We are not told the girl's name. We are not told what she thought, or whether she pressed him, or what became of her. She appears in the firelight, lands the first crack in Peter's armor, and disappears from the record. Scripture does not tie every thread into a bow, but it does tell us what we need to know, and it is this. After that first denial, Peter did not leave. He stayed by the fire. He kept warming his hands. He chose to remain in the place where the danger was. And that decision is what set up everything that followed. Because Luke tells us that about an hour passed. An hour. Sit with that. The first denial was not one panicked instant he could later blame on surprise. He had a full hour. 60 minutes of standing at that fire, hearing his own lie hang in the air, with every chance to slip out the gate and vanish like the others. And he stayed. Sometime in that hour, the fire tested him again. Another voice, another accusation. You also are one of them, one of his followers. And this time Peter does not just deny it quietly. He denies it with an oath. He swears. He calls heaven to witness that he does not know the man. The lie is hardening now, getting louder, getting more desperate, because the first lie always makes the second one easier. This is how it works for all of us. The first small compromise doesn't feel like the edge of a cliff. It feels like a way to stay warm a little longer. And by the time you realize where you're standing, you have said it twice, and the ground is already sliding. Before we go on to the third, and to the sound that ends this whole night. If this account of Peter is meeting you somewhere, take a second to subscribe, so the next walk through Scripture finds you. Now, back to the fire, because someone in that crowd is about to recognize Peter's face for a very specific reason. And then a relative of the man whose ear he cut off looked hard at him. Remember Malchus. Remember the ear, sliced off in the garden and healed by Jesus in the dark. John tells us that one of the people at that fire was a relative of Malchus, and he had been in the garden. He looks at Peter across the coals and says, "Did I not see you there, in the olive grove with him? Of everyone in that courtyard, this is the worst possible man to be recognized by." He was not guessing. He had seen Peter's face by torchlight, hours earlier, sword in hand. This is not a servant girl's hunch anymore. This is an eyewitness, and Peter breaks completely. The third denial is not 4 quiet words. Matthew and Mark tell us he began to curse and to swear. He calls down curses on himself. He shouts it. I do not know the man he had walked away from his nets to follow, the man he had called the Son of the living God, the man he had promised, only hours before, to die beside. I do not know the man. It is the boast from the upper room turned exactly inside out. I will never fall away has become I do not know him, in the space of a single night. And in that instant, the word still hot in his mouth, a rooster crows. Mark, whose gospel many believe came from Peter's own memories, adds a detail no one else does. He says the rooster crowed a second time, as if Peter, telling this story years later, could still hear the exact sequence of it. The first crow he must have missed or ignored, the second one he could not. But the sound is not even the worst of it. Luke gives us the detail that turns this from a story of failure into something that will break your heart. Luke says that at that very moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Turned and looked. Which means Jesus was close enough to see him. The trial was happening in a room raised above or open to that central courtyard. And Jesus, bound, beaten, in the middle of being condemned to death, turns his head, finds Peter's face in the firelight below, and looks at him. Across the whole night, across the coals and the guards and the crowd, their eyes meet. Jesus does not shout. He does not accuse. He looks. And that look does what no accusation could. There is no anger in it that we are told of, no pointing, no words hurled across the courtyard. Just the face of the friend he had sworn to die for, meeting his eyes at the exact instant of the third lie. A shout Peter could have argued with. A shout he could have deflected. But there's nothing to argue with in a look like that. It goes straight past every defense and lands where the truth already lived. Luke tells us Peter remembered. In that single glance, the whole prediction came flooding back before the rooster crows 3 times. And the man who followed through the gate, the man who could not be scared off by soldiers or servants, the man brave enough to draw a sword against an armed mob. That man finally breaks. Not from fear, from grief. He goes out. And Scripture gives us 5 of the heaviest words in the Gospels. He went outside and wept bitterly. Now, most of us remember the rooster as the accuser in this story. The alarm that catches Peter red-handed, the sound of his shame. But look again at what the rooster actually does. It does not condemn him. It wakes him up. It is the exact sound Jesus told him to listen for. The appointed signal that pulls Peter out of his spiral and hands him back the memory of every word Jesus said. That crow was not the sound of a trap closing. It was the sound of grace calling his name in the dark, reminding him that he had been warned, which meant he had been known, which meant even this had not taken Jesus by surprise. The rooster was not there to accuse Peter. It was there to bring him home. But the fire in the courtyard was not the last fire in this story. Turn ahead, past the cross, past the empty tomb, to a morning on the shore of a lake. The friends have gone back to fishing, back to the ordinary work they knew before any of this began. They have been out all night and caught nothing. And in the gray light of dawn, a figure on the beach calls out to them and tells them where to cast the net, and suddenly the net is full. It is Jesus, alive. And when Peter drags himself up onto that beach, soaking and stunned, he finds that Jesus has already made breakfast. John tells us how. He had made a fire of coals. Here is where that word comes back. That very specific word for a charcoal fire, the one that appears only twice in the whole New Testament. The first time is the fire in the courtyard, where Peter denied him 3 times. The second time is this fire, on this shore. The same rare word, deliberately placed, so that a reader paying attention feels the echo in the pit of the stomach. Peter is standing at a charcoal fire again, and he must have smelled it, because smell is the sense that drags us straight back to the worst nights of our lives. The last time he stood at coals like these, he said, "I do not know the man." And Jesus gently asks him a question. "Simon, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes." And Jesus asks again, "Do you love me?" "Yes." And a third time, "Do you love me?" 3 times Peter had denied him at a fire of coals. 3 times at another fire of coals, Jesus lets him say it back. He does not lecture Peter. He does not replay the courtyard. He does not make him grovel. He simply hands him, one at a time, 3 chances to undo the 3 denials, and then gives him his work back. That is what Christ does. He returns to the exact place of your failure, the same fire, the same smell, the same wound, not to reopen it, but to heal it clean. And notice where he does it, not in a temple, not in a moment of triumph, on an ordinary beach, over breakfast, in the plainest setting imaginable. That is the other thing Christ does. He does not wait for you to become impressive before he restores you. He meets you soaking wet and ashamed, on a Tuesday, over a meal, and calls you back to work. So look at the 2 men. At the start of this story stands a man who is loud, certain, and sure he could never fall. A man who has never yet been tested and does not know his own weakness. At the end stands a different man entirely. Quieter, broken, and mended. A man who has failed at the worst possible moment, wept in the dark over it, and been personally, tenderly restored by the one he betrayed. He is not the same. He could never be the same. And that is the whole point, which leaves us 3 things to carry out of that courtyard. First, getting close enough to fail is not the same as running away. 10 men avoided Peter's denial only because they avoided the courtyard entirely. Do not mistake the safety of distance for faithfulness. The people who risk the most are often the ones with the most visible scars. Second, grace often sounds like an alarm, not a verdict. The rooster was not there to condemn Peter. It was there to wake him. When something jolts you awake to how far you have drifted, that is not the sound of a door closing. That is mercy, calling your name. Third, the place of your worst failure can become the place of your restoration. Peter fell at a charcoal fire. Peter was healed at a charcoal fire. The location of your deepest shame is exactly where Christ loves to meet you. Same fire, same smell, new ending. If this walk through Scripture meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us, because we are going to keep going through these stories in order, one at a time. Until then, may you hear the rooster as grace, and may you find him waiting for you at the fire. Peace be with you.